we are done with the harsh topics. Now we're just skipping to the a little bit lighter ones, since I'm dealing with something totally different than most of you. I'm not dealing with the cross-border, for example, Schengen area. I'm dealing with the intra-EU migrations and the labor migrations. And especially I'm dealing with the treatment of the CEE workers in the European Union labor market. So my apologies that I am the last one. And if I'm going to kill you with boredom, again, my apologies. But first I'm going to explain you, probably, I'm not sure who is dealing with those kinds of topics. So first I'm going to explain you just briefly what is the freedom of movement of workers, how is it regulated, and so on, but just briefly. So when we are talking about the free movement of workers, we are actually talking about the Article 45 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And there are also secondary legislation that are regulating the movement of workers and the equal treatment of the workers within the European Union labor market. But the provision that was the focal point of my research for this specific paper was the prohibition of discrimination based on nationality in the scope of employment, remuneration, and other employment conditions, which meant that no one should be discriminated based on nationality within the European Union. But now I'm going to talk about a little bit controversial topic, which is the transitional arrangements. You probably remember that the transitional arrangements were introduced within the European Union labor market for up to 7 years, in which the workers couldn't move from one country to another. But my hypothesis was that the provision that I just mentioned was violated with the transitional arrangements. So just to briefly explain who is a worker in the scope of the freedom of movement of workers, we have to emphasize that there has to be three conditions that to consider someone as a worker. There is a so-called Lavry-Bloom formula according to the Court of Justice of the European Union decision. So first we have to have the subordination, so working for another person. We have the remuneration, so actually the salary, which doesn't have to be a certain amount. And we also have to have the effective and genuine activities, which means that, for example, helping your family member cannot be considered as an employment condition, and you can't be actually considered as a worker within the European Union. However, the thing that I was actually exploring in this paper that I published in Ljubljana was actually the issue of transitional arrangements. So just to briefly explain what are the transitional arrangements, I'm going to come back to this slide. So the transitional arrangements are actually the period of time in which the workers cannot, from the new member states, cannot move from one state to another. Transitional arrangements are not obligatory, so the member states can decide to implement transitional arrangements or not. In the case of the Central and Eastern European countries, almost all countries were actually under the transitional arrangements. I'm going to explain it a little bit later on why. But the transitional arrangements can last up to 7 years. But there is a formula that says that it can last for 2 years. Basically, all member states are applying the bilateral agreements and national rules. Then, if the country wants to extend this period of restrictions for up to 5 years, it has to just say to the Commission that it was necessary and justified to safeguard the national labor market. And additionally, it can actually extend it to 7 years if there are serious disturbances of the labor market or the national labor market. So, for example, if Belgium wants to safeguard their national labor market from the new member states workers, so they think that there will be a massive instant migration of workers from a new country to Belgium, then Belgium can introduce transitional arrangements for up to 7 years. So when the European Union started to introduce the transitional arrangements, they started with Greece, Spain, and Portugal. And they said that it is because of the safeguarding of the European labor market and so on. But when the Central and Eastern European countries started to enter into the European Union, the European Union said that it is a great opportunity for the Central and Eastern European countries to return to Europe, to break the border between the East and the West, to help the ex-communist countries to become a little bit more closer to the European Union. But then they introduced the transitional arrangements, which was a little bit contradictory to everything that they were talking about before. And it is definitely reasonable, because I also did the empirical research on the salaries, minimum salaries of the Central and Eastern European countries and the Western countries in the time of their accession. And for example, the minimum salary in Croatia, when Croatia entered the European Union, was around 350 euros. And for example, in Netherlands, it was around 1,500. So you can actually understand why Western countries were scared that there will be a massive migration from the east to the west, and they are going to destroy the national labor markets. But my question was it proportionate? Was it proportionate to actually introduce the transitional arrangements? So they introduced the transitional arrangements first in 2004 for the EU 8 countries, even though that in 2004 actually 10 countries entered into the European Union. However, Cyprus and Malta were excluded because of the reasons that weren't actually very justified. They didn't actually say why did they exclude Cyprus and Malta, but from the context you can actually understand that Cyprus and Malta were in much better financial situation than other countries that entered into the European Union. Then we had the Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, and then Croatia in 2013, and all three categories of countries were actually included into the transitional arrangements. Also, I'm going to just explain what were the impacts of the transitional arrangements. And I want to answer first, how did they impact on workers, on the status of workers from Central and Eastern Europe. And second, I want to answer if transitional arrangements should be applied to the new member states that are going to enter into the European Union one day. For example, the candidate countries such as Serbia, Ukraine, and so on. So there is a question if those countries should be under the transitional arrangements or not. So when we are talking about the impact of the transitional arrangements, first I already mentioned that Greece, Spain, and Portugal were also under those restrictions. However, the European Commission did the research, and what actually happened with the transitional arrangements with those three countries, totally opposite that the European Union thought. Actually, the reversed migration happened. When those three countries entered the European Union, those countries, actually workers, saw it as an opportunity to come back home. Those that were abroad, they actually got back to Greece, Spain, and Portugal. So nothing actually happened with the massive migration that the European Union expected. So that was actually the European Commission explained it as the reason why they introduced it for the Central and Eastern European countries, but that was a reason that wasn't really justified. The second one is actually the contradictory measures, responses from the old member states. For example, United Kingdom, Ireland, and Sweden didn't introduce the transitional arrangements. So they just allowed all the workers from the new member states to enter into their labor markets. And what happened? They cherry-picked the best workers. So actually, they did the good thing because they employed the best of the best. And the others remained for those who introduced the restrictions. Also, the thing that I'm actually dealing with the most are the posted workers and the exploitation of posted workers. The posted workers are the ones that are sent from one country to another, for example, for 3, 4, 5 months, just to do the job, and are returning to their country. But the posted workers were excluded from the transitional arrangements. But why? That was actually a tactic of the European Union, because posted workers first are under the freedom of movement of services, so they are not actually workers. Second, they are remaining on the social security system of the domestic country, which means that they are not going to implement or they are not going to cause the so-called social tourism in the Western countries. Also, the self-employed people also weren't included into the transitional arrangements, and what caused that a lot of people from Balkan, let's call it like that, became businessmen in the Western Europe. So they became the self-employed people. They opened up their companies, but they weren't actually businessmen, but they saw it as a hole in the legislation, and they just used it to move to the Western countries. So the European Union didn't actually took into account posted workers and self-employed, which was totally nonsense. And my question was, what were the transitional arrangements, and if the transitional arrangements are going to be applied to the new member state, is that a kind of discrimination based on nationality? I already told you that there were different approaches to Malta and Cyprus, but also I want to mention something. When I was on Geneva's conference, one professor from Belgium told me that they are still using in the everyday communication this stereotype of Polish plumber. So when they want to joke about that someone is a cheap labor force, that they are having a low remuneration, they are calling him a Polish plumber. Okay, I mean, that is an indirect discrimination, basically, but they're not even thinking about it, because that is so deeply rooted into the Western culture that the Central and Eastern European workers are less valuable, that they are not even processing it, that is basically an indirect discrimination. And also, what are the implications for the future enlargements? I will tell it from the side of Croatia. From the side of Croatia, there is a nonsense to introduce the transitional arrangements for the new member states, because we lack the workforce. We are now actually importing the workforce from third countries, those that are not even candidate countries. So why would, for example, Croatia introduce the transitional arrangements? Why would, for example, the countries that lack the workforce introduce the transitional arrangements? That is a nonsense. And now I'm going to, for the end, I'm not going to bother you anymore. I'm going to show you what I did with an empirical research. So last year I did an empirical research on 184 Croatian citizens living in Germany. I actually contacted the Croatian Catholic communities in Germany, and they helped me a lot, because they spreaded the anonymous poll that I created through the Croatian Catholic communities, and then I got actually quite a huge number of participants. And I actually had in that poll 30 questions. However, I'm going to show you the results only of one question. However, that poll was actually introduced for the purposes of getting into the question if the Central and Eastern European countries are discriminated or not in the Western European labor market. So I'm going to show you just the results of one poll. So there are a lot of research that the Central and Eastern European countries' workers are actually now preferred in the Western Europe because they are good workers. That is mentioned in a couple of research. And I wanted to check if they are actually good workers or there is something hidden behind it. And now I bolded only the dramatic answers. So, for example, those that are a little bit questionable, that the reasons why employers actually hire Croatian workers is because they are willing to work for lower wages, sometimes even below the minimum wage. Also, they tend to work overtime. They are easily manipulated. They are not complaining about the workload, and they are actually willing to work on the so-called black market. So the Central and Eastern European countries' workers are still, even after almost 20 years of accession in the European Union, they're still actually seen as second-class workers. And the question is if that kind of perception in the Western Europe is going to change, whether we can change it. Because the European Union is constantly promoting the anti-discrimination and so on, but we can see that that is deeply rooted not in the European Union politics, but in the community. So my question was actually if that can be changed and if the transitional arrangements were just an additional push toward the discrimination, and if we erase the transitional arrangements, would it help to reduce the discrimination based on nationality within the European Union? Labor market, because if we are treating the European Union citizens like this, the question is how are we treating the third countries' nationals? that would be it. Thank you.